It's really, really great to have you with us, and it is particularly wonderful to welcome Professor Mark Kligman, who is the Mickey Katz Endowed Chair in Jewish Music at UCLA, and he is also the director of the Lowell Milken Center for Jewish Music of the American Jewish Experience. Dr. Kligman specializes in the liturgical traditions of Middle Eastern Jewish communities and various areas of popular Jewish music. And he's published on the liturgical music of Syrian Jews in Brooklyn, which is one of the big reasons that we asked him to be here today. Dr. Kligman is also a dear friend and my former professor. Taught at HUC-JIR in New York when I was a student there. And it's 7.5 years ago, is that correct, Dr. Kligman, that we both arrived in Los Angeles?
I think that's right. I think that's right.
And yeah, and when we came out here, the Jewish Journal posted our photos right next to each other. It was a really wonderful, wonderful moment for me to share that space with you, Dr. Kligman, and I always look forward to sharing space with you. And I'm so excited that you're able to spend this time with our community, sharing about your experiences, learning about and studying the music and folk ways of the Syrian Jewish community. And we're about to celebrate a Shabbat where we are really celebrating Syrian Jews just this Friday at the Irmis campus. So for those of you joining us here, I hope you're also able to join us in person, or you can live stream us on Friday evening at 6:30. But let's just jump right in because we only have an hour, and I know there's so much for us to talk about. Dr. Kligman, can you share with us some of the typical Syrian traditional instruments? Give us an overview of those instruments, and what is the cultural context within which they are played?
Sure, happy to answer that, but let me first begin by saying thank you so much for this invitation, Cantor-Shapiro, and likewise, as it was both special for you to share the page, it's special for me too. We've known each other for a number of years, as you were a student when I taught at Hebrew Union College, and it's so wonderful to see how your career has blossomed and everything you bring to the community, to Wilshire Boulevard Temple, to the LA community, and it's really just so special to always be connected.
Thank you. I was hoping to skip over that part, but you slipped
it
in.
Well, the feeling is too strong, so just
thank you. Thank you.
So the instruments that the Syrian Jews use are pretty much what one would say would be the standard instruments of Middle Eastern music. So I have an image. So let me just go ahead and just quickly share that image of these instruments.
Great. I think that's really helpful for people to be able to see those. Fabulous.
And the instruments are the furthest to our right that looks like a pear-shaped string instrument is called the oud. This is the main instrument in Middle Eastern music. The oud to Middle Eastern music is what the piano is to Western music. In Western music, if anyone studies music, everything is theorized around the piano. In Middle Eastern music, everything is geared towards the oud. And the oud is unique in the sense that it's similar to a guitar or a forerunner of the guitar, but where the guitar has frets for particular notes, the oud does not. The other instrument that's behind it, that's longer, that's sort of trapezoidal, is called the kanun. And the kanun is a zither, where one would have picks on their fingers and then sort of pick at the strings to really make the sound. And they do so in great rapidity. Another instrument is the nai, or what we would say in English would be the flute, and that's the bamboo what looks like the bamboo cane. And the way that Middle Eastern music works, that I'm sure we'll get into, is they make use of different scales than we have in Western music. So they make use of notes we don't have on a standard Western instrument. So a nai player has to have actually 3 different flutes. And the flute that they choose is dependent upon what's called the maqam, or the scale that they're in. The other instruments that you see are a violin and a cello, and these would be more modern adaptations to traditional Middle Eastern music. And this is really based upon the explorations, or the way that as Napoleon sort of comes into the Middle East in the early 1800s, and there's a steady flow of Western influence throughout the 19th century, just increases with the building of the Suez Canal. And through the Western influence, the violins, cellos come into a Middle Eastern ensemble, and they're really available instruments because they too don't have frets on them. So a violin can play the music of the maqam. And then lastly, on the left, you see what we would call a tambourine, that this sort of frame drum is just one form of a drum they would have. The other one is a doumbek, which I'm sure people are pretty familiar with, which is the hourglass shaped drum. I just didn't have a picture of all the instruments with the doumbek in it, but that would be the additional instrument.
Thank you so much for taking us through those. So now I'm aware that as far as I know, if there's a Jewish community in Syria at this time, it's just a few people. Are there any Jews still living in Syria now?
There are very few. There are not any known to be living in Aleppo. There are some still living in Damascus. It's really not known how many there are.
Okay.
In 1992, the previous president Hafez Assad gave travel abilities for Syrian Jews, which basically meant that they could leave the country. Traveling didn't mean that they were going to return. And there were thousands that left since that period of time in 1992. And the pathway for those Syrian Jews that left in recent years has either been Israel or to Brooklyn, New York. And Brooklyn, New York, where I did my study, is home to the largest Syrian community. And they're estimated to be 75,000 Syrian Jews living in Brooklyn. And they live in what's called the Flatbush or Sheepshead Bay section of Brooklyn. And they have 40 different institutions, including 15 synagogues. They have a community center. They have a number of retirement facilities. They're really an all-encompassing community that really tries to really stay together. And they're a very, very tight-knit community. I realize I didn't answer your question about when the instruments are played. So do you want to get back to that?
Yeah, so I wanted to, first of all, when are they played? Who plays them? You said these are Middle Eastern instruments, so I'm assuming Jews play them, non-Jews play them. And
right.
when, where, what?
So since instruments are not played in the synagogue for the Syrian Jews and most of the Middle Eastern Jewish community, because of the ban on playing musical instruments after the destruction of the Second Temple, they would only be played on occasions where it wouldn't be Shabbat or a holiday. So those occasions would be, might be a Brit Milah that would, take place in the synagogue, or it could take place in someone's home, or it could be a party. And they use the Arabic term that's called hafla. So if they had a party in someone's house, they would bring in a Middle Eastern ensemble. Sometimes there are people in the community, depending on whose wedding it is, that people in the community might play the instruments. If at a wedding or a bar mitzvah, depending on how big or how elaborate it is, they might have like a dance band that might, play, contemporary dance music, and then have a set for the Middle Eastern ensemble. So it just depends on who it is. In large measure, the Syrian Jews were not known to really be instrumentalists. The Syrian Jews, particularly the Jews in Aleppo, were really the patrons of the arts, and not just in terms of Jewish music, but in terms of Arabic music. And as very well-known Middle Eastern artists would travel through the Middle East playing, Aleppo was always a spot. And so they were just patrons of what would be considered Arabic classical or Arabic popular music. What's interesting is that if you compare the journey of the Syrian Jews to the Iraqi Jews were really the musicians in the Iraqi world. And in 1956, when the Iraqi Jews left Iraq, they said that their national orchestra had to close for a short period of time because so many Jews were out of the country that they had to rebuild the orchestra.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Wow. Thank you for that. What a loss.
Yeah, I mean, these are really fascinating stories that, just like the Holocaust, like there's so many other stories that are being told so many decades later. There's a recent book that just came out by Chris Silver, who's a scholar who looks at the Moroccan Jewish community. And apparently in Marrakesh and even in Fez, where the center of the city is where the Jewish community was. And the Jews were very involved with the musical life, the musical culture of those environments. So the Jewish engagement with Middle Eastern music is a very, very fascinating story. But for the Syrian Jews, the music making is largely done most frequently in the synagogue on Shabbat. And some of the music that they play, there's a repertoire that they call the Pismonim. Mm-hmm. Pismon in modern Hebrew basically means like a chorus, like a song that has a chorus. So a pismon would be a type of Hebrew poetry, a poetic text. Pismonim would be the plural of pismon. So they would sing these pismonim in the synagogue, often between aliyot. So they would read the entire Torah portion, and they read at a pretty moderate speed, and reading, the whole Torah portion could take 45 minutes. And to break up the various aliyot, they might have a group of people that would come up to the bima, come up to where the Torah is being read, and they would sing pismonims, kind of like, like the singers in the community would sing. And there are various pismonim that are associated with certain parshiot, with certain calendrical things that are happening in the Jewish calendar. And many of them are very familial oriented, because all these pismonim, well, I shouldn't say all, the vast majority were really written by rabbis in the community that were commissioned for a simcha. Someone's having a bar mitzvah, baby naming, wedding, anniversary, and they would commission one of the rabbis to write.
The rabbis write the words alone, or did they also compose melodies?
So by and large, the vast majority of this repertoire is what we would say a contrafact or a borrowed repertoire, where they're taking popular Arabic melodies and they're replacing the Arabic words with Hebrew words. So it's not an original composition process. That being said, what I show in my book, and my mentor, Keshelme, your previous guest on the Ethiopian community, she also wrote a book on the Syrian Pismonim. And often the way that they sing these songs, the singers take a lot of liberties. So even though that it might be, a known tune, they're stylizing it in their own way, or sometimes there's some form of improvisation.
So it's like a really great cover.
Correct. That's great. I love that. That's a great
layman's terms.
Right. Yeah, exactly. exactly.
That's terrific. So most of the Syrian Jews you've explained to us have left Syria, are either in Brooklyn or in Israel. We know that they've kept some many of their folkways and the feeling of these musics with them, and use them in synagogue, etc. But have there been outside influences for either community, and how does that exhibit itself? How do they differ from each other in terms of their folkways and their music?
Yeah, great and wonderful question. Just some other quick notes. There are also Syrian communities in different parts of South America, in Buenos Aires and Bogota, and Mexico City. In fact, the Mexico City community is a very large Syrian community, and they're mostly Jews from Damascus, where the community in Brooklyn is largely from Aleppo. So the additional influences are really quite interesting. I would say that this is not a scientific measurement, it's just more of a sense, that 60 to 70% of the melodies that they sing are from Arabic music, and Arabic music that's been written by more in the modern era, meaning late 1800s, early 1900s. So it really reflects the 20th century repertoire of people like Muhammad Abdul Wahab, Farid al-Atrash, Kulthum, and many others, but those would be the big names. And then the other 30 to 40% would be Turkish melodies. And those Turkish melodies are in large part not really known today. And it makes sense that there would be Turkish melodies that would be in some of the repertoire, because they did live under the Ottoman Empire for many years. And then there's just a very small percentage of tunes that we found, Kay Chalamet and I, that are American influenced tunes. So let me tell you some of those stories. And they're interesting stories, but again, these are just like a handful as opposed to the hundreds of other melodies. Literally, there are known to be about 500 melodies that are part of their repertoire. So I'm only talking now about 5. So one is that when they have this red book that's called Shir Ushvacha Halav Zimrah, which is their book of these Pismo name of the poetry. And in it, as they list the song, they have a little appellation at the top that's called lachan, which basically means the melody. What's the melodic source? And often the lachan would indicate where the Arabic song is. So it's a very conscious approach as to what they're doing. If it's a Turkish melody and they don't know the name of it, they might just say Turkiya or say muzika, which means just music or Turkey. But one of them said 62. And this was part of Kay Chalamet's research. And then they were asking to say, well, what does 62 represent? And the story goes like this. In Brooklyn, all of the public schools are known by numbers.
Right.
So there's PS 19, PS 20, and there's PS 62, Public School 62. Public School 62 used the Christmas song O Tannenbaum as their school melody. So it went, oh, 62, oh, 62. And then they just adapted, since people went to that public school and they knew that tune, and they just knew it not as O Tannenbaum, they knew it as 62. So they took the song 62.
Oh my goodness.
There's other examples moving later on of taking melodies from Fiddler on the Roof. And it's really quite interesting to see how, ubiquitous Fiddler on the Roof is, into many Jewish communities, not just Ashkenazic communities. And of course, they're in New York, so they're going to have those influences. And the other thing that I observed, I only went to a couple of Syrian weddings, and I did my research in the early 90s. And around that time, I forgot the exact year this is, the movie Titanic came out. So the theme song that Celine Dion sings, like My Heart Will Go On, became like the song that the Cantor sang as the cantor entered as like his song to the bride and groom. So it's just fascinating to see how this Pismonian repertoire develops. It's sort of fluid. Most of it today, though, it's not as dynamic, let's say, as it was in the 30s and 20s, 30s, and 40s. And during that time of their early immigration to Brooklyn, they had the rabbis who were called payetanim, or poets, who did a lot of this adapting. And that really waned by like the 1970s. So today they're more or less keeping the older melodies alive. Although, I mean, I'm just talking in generalities. There's some exceptions to that. And what's interesting in the research that I've done of their Shabbat services in terms of what they do on Shabbat, they've incorporated a number of Israeli melodies. So the Hatikva is the melody that they'll use for Baruch She'amar. They'll use Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. I mean, a number of the well-known sort of Israeli tunes also find their way into the liturgy.
That's fascinating. Really, really interesting. So you talked a little bit earlier about the prohibition against using instruments. And it occurred to me that not everyone in this group, being that we're a Reform synagogue, not everyone in this group may even know about that or be aware of it. So if you could share a little bit about that, and then share with us about the expression of Judaism within the Syrian community and how that's expressed. My guess is it's, not the way that West Side Reform Jews are expressing their Judaism.
Yeah.
And how do they frame, how do they see themselves within the Jewish world?
So in terms of the ban on musical instruments, there are a number of statements in rabbinic literature. First in the Mishnah, which is codified in the year 250, which really talks about the fact that since the Sanhedrin, or the rabbinical court, ceased, and that was just a few years before the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed in the year 70, that music ceased and music wasn't played. And there are long discussions in rabbinic literature that go on for a few hundred years. And around the 8th or 9th century, a rabbi known as Meiri basically states that he makes the association that music isn't played because of what's called Hurban Habayit, or the destruction of the temple. And the sensibility is that we need to have within Jewish life, or this is in his view in the 8th century, sadness. We can't have that full expression of joy, because the Beit HaMikdash, which really is the main modality of Jewish expression, is ceasing to function. So that sadness is expressed in different ways. And it's a tradition that we still have, where we break a glass at the end of a wedding, right? So that sense of breaking a glass is somehow in memory of this destruction, that we, even on a happy occasion, we should still mark that moment. And it's basically become the standard practice in communities that are very strictly following halakha to not have musical instruments, and in various other rabbinic texts that have been developed, such as the Shulchan Aruch in the 14th, 15th century, basically claims that you can't use a musical instrument because if it breaks, you may come to repair it. There are rethinkings, or I don't know if that's a word, rethinkings, but there's a rethinking of that over time. And first in Italy and then Germany, there are various communities that are part of the Enlightenment, that are part of this rebirth of culture in Europe, that start including various instruments. And first they begin potentially playing instruments on Kabbalat Shabbat. So the service that sort of just precedes Shabbat, before one says Psalm 92, Mizmor Shir L'Yom HaShabbat, the L'chuna Ranana L'cha Dodi, that whole aspect of Kabbalat Shabbat, it's not yet considered to be fully Shabbat. So some communities started playing musical instruments then, and then it grew and developed. And of course, it's become a hallmark of the Reform movement. And Reform thinkers, the belief is that the recreation of the temple service is what Reform Judaism represents. So where there was a prior ban, Reform Judaism doesn't express that ban, and just the opposite, wants to beautify synagogue services and include instruments and services. So that's a pretty big distinction between, let's say, Reform and Orthodox. And as many things go, conservative synagogues may differ depending upon how they view. Is there more you want me to say about that? Or is
No,
that...
I think that's perfect. I just want to interject for just a moment that one of the things that I try to share with our folks when we're doing these Shabbat Zimrah experiences when we're together and we have the music is that I do have instruments there. So it is very much not what you would hear if you went to a Syrian synagogue. Or last month we did Ethiopian music, and what I'm doing is a layering. And I'm very aware of that. And I feel that, based on what you've shared with us, Professor Kligman, it is a Reform approach to honoring these traditions and representing them and sharing some of the stylistic elements, musical stylistic elements. But I want to be very clear that I am very aware that we are not bringing to you what you would hear in a Syrian synagogue in Brooklyn. And Dr. Kligman can tell you where you can go visit if you're interested in hearing that. And I think you actually have a musical example of that.
Yeah. Do you want me to you had asked me a question about the Reform community as Jews. Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
So the Syrian community takes incredible pride in their heritage. And in large measure, it's because there's biblical roots to Jews in Syria. It says in the Bible that King David asked Yoav ben Surya to conquer the north. And the term that's used for Aleppo that's called Aram Tsova, and the term for Damascus that's called in Hebrew Aram Damasek, are actually mentioned in the Bible. They're mentioned in Divrei Hayamim, or they're mentioned in the Book of Chronicles. They're also represented in the Book of Psalms. They're discussed with some frequency in rabbinic literature. So the fact that there are Syrian Jews who have been in Syria for thousands of years is what the community takes great heritage in. And they really take great pride in their connection to King David. So anyone in the community that's a redhead is considered to be a descendant of King David. And that might be more folklore than an actual belief, but that's something that's very much discussed in the Syrian community. And the other thing is, it's like, in Reform Judaism, almost every community in the United States that has a Reform community has a Temple Emmanuel, right? That's like a really important name for the Reform movement. For Syrian Jews, the same would be for that name Magen David, or the Shield of David. So every Syrian community has a school, a synagogue called Magen David. So this connection to King David is very important. I would say, amongst myself, who's not a Syrian Jew, and the other anthropologists or sociologists that have studied the Syrian community, that, and it'd be interesting to know if they're members of your community that hail from the Syrian community or have some connections, that many people in the Syrian community really feel that they're the superior Jew, that their view of Judaism is that they're at the top and all other forms of Judaism just don't compare to them.
That makes them just like every other Jew.
So exactly. Right. So, I mean, that's, I think, the way to really understand it, that their way is the best way. One of the things that I found in my experience of praying with them, of studying, of being with them for the couple years that I was doing my research, is that all their synagogues are, Orthodox in the sense that they don't have instruments, that people who come behave in Orthodox fashion, but that doesn't mean that the community is Orthodox. So people might drive to synagogue or, just silence their cell phones when they walk into synagogue. I mean, whatever their personal practices is what it is. But when they come into the synagogue, they behave in the way that is respectful of the synagogue. And there are really multiple generations that really are in the synagogue. And there's a really beautiful custom that if you're a son and your father gets an aliyah, that you stand in the congregation when your father has an aliyah. The Sephardic communities do the priestly blessing during the Amidah. So that's something that the Ashkenazi community doesn't do outside of Israel, except for the high holy days or the three festivals. But every day, including Shabbat, they always have the priestly blessing. And the Sephardic communities actually have a lot of Kohanim. So it's really quite fascinating to see this great shuffle of the hundreds of people in the synagogue when you suddenly have, at the end of the Amidah, a group of men and boys who are above bar mitzvah come to do the priestly blessing, with the tallis over their heads and so forth. And then the rest of the community just reposition themselves to receive the blessings. So all of the traditions and the customs of the community, I could go on with some of their really unique customs, but they take great pride in those customs. And it's a fascinating community in that as much financial success as they've had, and often in the Ashkenazi community, financial success meant to moving out of the Lower East Side or moving out of the community, moving to another neighborhood, and somehow maybe not necessarily being so connected to Judaism. The Syrian community has done the opposite. They, as affluent as they are, and there are incredibly affluent Syrian Jews, all they've done with what they are doing in the process is building their community, making their community stronger, making sure that they're taking care of sick people, taking care of elderly people, taking care of young families. It's really an amazing thing to see how a tight-knit community is functioning and just very, very vibrant.
That's beautiful. Maybe they got something there. Maybe they are the best Jews. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your field work and your time spent in Brooklyn. Some of the things you've shared, a couple of things that make that experience unique, but maybe just walk us through like what it would be, what some of your experiences were there, what it would be like to spend Shabbat with a Syrian family in Brooklyn. Some of those sorts of things. Our last talk, people were really interested in the fieldwork piece of
Sure.
what you do. Yeah.
Well, unlike my mentor, Professor K. Kaufman Shalomé, that went to Gondar in Ethiopia, I just had to walk a few blocks from where I lived in Brooklyn to go into the Syrian community. Might be helpful. Maybe I'll just put up this image. Just so you can see this. And this is a map of Brooklyn. And as someone who's an LA native, I never take it for granted that people may not know Brooklyn. But this is the Flatbush section of Brooklyn. And pretty much from Avenue I, which is where that top star is, sort of in the middle of the top, down to Avenue U, is the heart of the Syrian community. And that street's called Ocean Parkway. And the community houses, or where people live, is basically a few blocks on either side of Ocean Parkway. If you look to the top, to the right, to that top star, that was one of the newer synagogues in the 90s when I was doing my research. So the community has started to expand in that direction. And now there are Syrian synagogues that are Spanish speaking, like Jews who come from South America have their own Syrian synagogues. So they've gotten sort of very nuanced into the different sort of Syrian diaspora communities. Of the 15, or there may be a little more than that, synagogues today, there are 2 from Damascus. All the other big ones are really follow the Aleppo traditions. And this is sort of where the main synagogues are, where you see these stars on these various letter avenues. So between S to U is where most of them are. The one that I worked at is called Bet Torah, and that's where that top star is on the map, which is between avenues J and K. And, the community, I mean, a good way to sort of express it is there's an anthropologist I worked with who writes in a book that I said this, but I don't remember saying it. So I'll say it in his name. His name is Walter Zenner. And it goes like this, that the Syrian Jews who are living in Brooklyn and the men who are working, women too, often are working, in Manhattan, they're working through Brooklyn. Many of them are in different forms of commerce, many of them work in the fashion industry or textiles, different forms of import and trade. And when they're, on the subway or just getting, into New York, they're not looking all that distinct. It's very different than like the enclave of a Hasidic community where Hasidic Jews aim to really look and act very different. The Syrian Jews aren't really acting that different. So the adage that Walter Zenner says is that when Syrian Jews are the most Jewish, and that is when they're in the synagogue, they're performing or acting out the most Arabic part of their identity. So the Syrian community takes great pride in their Arab heritage. So maintaining these Arabic melodies is very important to their tefillah. It's a really vitally significant aspect of how they're Jewish or how they express themselves. They often will have, their various Middle Eastern foods that are not particularly Jewish. Of course, they make them kosher so they're, so they can eat them, such as, lahmanjan or kibbeh, the different type of Middle Eastern, lahmanjan, or they call it Middle Eastern pizza, but it's basically a little sort of circular, maybe 3 inches of dough with ground meat, very, very tasty meat that's on top of it with various pine nuts. Kibbeh are these like dough-filled, like torpedo-shaped delicacies that are filled with ground meat as well. There are various desserts that they have. I mean, there are various Middle Eastern foods that are very traditional to them that they always keep up for traditional meals. But that's not necessarily something that they're eating every day of the week. But on Shabbat, on Jewish holidays, this is when they go to their Jewish Arab heritage. So their practices, for me, were so interesting and so unique. The first time I went into a Syrian synagogue and tried to follow along, and I've been going to synagogues all my life. I mean, I really couldn't locate where they were in the Siddur. I mean, their Hebrew pronunciation, follows more of an Arabic dialect. So it took me a long time to really get the sensibility of what they're doing. So the way that I did that is that Kay Shelmay introduced me to various cantorial leaders in the community. And there are 3 in particular that I worked with. And one of the main ones who I worked with, who's trained most of the cantors of the community, sadly, he passed away. I think he was well over 100 when he passed away. His name is Mo Tawil. And he trained me like you would train a child. I started with learning how to recite the Shema in the Syrian style, then learning how to do biblical recitation, to read the Torah, and then to say the morning brachot. There's another cantor I worked with at Bet Torah named Isaac Cabasso, and they had a group of young men who are roughly my age. I was in my 20s when I was doing the research, And these men were all learning the Pismo tradition. So every Monday night we would meet with Cantor and we would learn various Pismo. He'd teach them, we'd sing them. And then on Shabbat, he would sort of lead the singing and want us to come and sing along with him. So I really had tremendous access to working in the community. And in large measure, my mentor, Keshelmi, said, you know, it's really going to take an Orthodox man to do this topic, because otherwise it's going to be hard to have access to the community. So I was fortunate that that worked out well for me. And it's something that I just dearly loved doing, just to represent, just to learn about a different Jewish community. And the men I was studying were men who were the age of my grandparents or my grandfathers. And I found it so interesting just to kind of compare what my family's story is of coming to America to the story of the Syrian community.
Wonderful. I think we're at the point where we've got 15 minutes left.
Okay, should we play some music?
Yeah, let's play some music, and then I want to let everyone know that you know, now's the time to kind of think of any questions. You can the best thing probably is put them in the chat box, and then if there are ones that kind of overlap, I can ask them together. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. We're gonna hear a musical example here.
So I'm going to play two examples, if that's all right. And each one, I think we could play maybe about 2 minutes of each. The first one is really interesting, and I just found out about it recently from a young Syrian man. And this was recorded in the 1970s in Israel. So there is a Syrian community in Israel, not as numerous as the one in Brooklyn. And there was a documentary that was done of the Syrian community singing something called Bakashot. And Bakashot are poems that they recite, and they would come early to the synagogue on before sunrise on Saturday morning, and for a couple hours sing these melodies. And once the sun rose, they would do the morning prayers, and they do that in the winter months, so between Sukkot and Passover. So it's a practice that's still being done in Israel. It's not being done in Brooklyn, but this is a staging of that. So they didn't actually film this on the Saturday morning. They just had people come to synagogue during the week. So we'll play a couple minutes, and you'll just hear how different the music is. And I think it's really a wonderful representation.
שרים בשעה כזו. בחוץ עוד מעט יתחיל לעלות.
So you can hear the narrator telling us, what's happening. And I think what this beautifully represents is the spontaneity, the energy, the joy, the love. And the way that this music is learned is all orally. I mean, the books are looking at just have the text. No one in this community is really trained to read music. They're all learning this by ear. And this melody, these melodies are complex. The music is really its own form of artistry. And people who do this really have tremendous skill. So what I want to do, the second example that I'll play is represents the Pismonim tradition. And this is just an audio. You'll see the text come up on the screen. And it's beautifully recorded. Unfortunately, I don't have the date that it was recorded, but the description of what I found this on YouTube. I can send the link if anyone's interested. But the people that it was referring to who were playing, it most likely was done in the late 80s or early 90s, and really represents this tradition very well. And this is a text called Atta el Kabir. So I just want to point out a few things. And the first thing to say is that if I were channeling the Syrian Jews that I know, they would say, after hearing that melody, how beautiful and wonderful it is, how can you be anything else than a Syrian Jew? I mean, that's what they would say to me if I were, working with them. They would say that in such an expressive way that Motawil would like grab my shoulder and squeeze my shoulder and say that with just great fervency. So what this tells us is that it's by Raphael and Tebi Tabush. He's one of the progenitors of this tradition. He was born in Aleppo, then emigrated to Syria in the early 1900s. And he's the person who wrote this. This is more than likely written in the 1920s. And what happens is you could see the letter Aleph here, kind of big, then a Nun here, and a Yud here, and that spells the word Ani. And then if you go to the other ones, we don't have the full text here, but it would spell out Raphael. So they say here the acrostic is Ani Raphael, or I am Raphael. That's his first name. And that's how they would structure these texts, is that they would write themselves into it, or if they're writing it for someone's family or for a wedding, they might put an acrostic of the name of the couple who's celebrating their anniversary, or the name of the boy who's being bar mitzvahed. The texts are these passionate texts. They're very devotional. You are the omnipotent God whose name is the merciful one. Oh, please have mercy on your treasured people. I mean, this translation really reflects, I think, the beauty of the Hebrew in many ways. For your mercies are inexhaustible, endless, and unlimited. So the model is that these poems really are very lofty, praiseworthy towards God. Sometimes they might start off talking about the creation of the world and the celestial spheres, and each paragraph may then come down to like the realm of the world that we really live in. So this is a way in which mysticism is so much a part of the lifeblood of the community. And the anthropologist Paul Zenner, who I quoted earlier, calls this folk mysticism, just in terms of how the mysticism is just really a part of the community. And just to give you one sort of quick little anecdote about that, when I lived in the East Coast, I lived in Highland Park, New Jersey. I sometimes taught at Rutgers University, and I taught a course called Sephardic History, Culture, and Music. The Syrian Jews have a summer community in Deal, New Jersey, where most of the Brooklyn community then goes to Deal, but there's a community that's now grown up and developed in Deal. And I often, in a class of 40 students, might have 10 Syrian kids in the class. And they were so stereotypical. They always sat in the back in the corner. They were like their own little mafia, you know, and they would always chime in with whatever I would say on different kind of things. And I just thought it's just so interesting how their mannerisms of pride really are extending to these, additional generations. I mean, the community is growing. Most Syrian Jews marry other Syrian Jews. That's not the case, 100%. I don't know the intermarriage rates in the community, so I can't quote them. I assume they're on the lower side, but they're not non-existent. I mean, they're there. I mean, in many ways, if people want to reject the community, they just leave the community. And there are so many stories. I think that Jerry Seinfeld hails from, I think his mother was a Syrian Jew. There are numerous examples of some famous people. Anyways, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. We've got a couple of questions here, but I just want to ask you one quick thing before we take those questions, which is, it seems like there's, a possibility for a little bit of cognitive dissonance here, in that the piece that you're saying that the Syrian Jews are so proud of, the music, right? In this world where we're so concerned with authenticity and not taking from, what isn't ours, but clearly the musical piece of it, it's contrafactum music. So clearly the musical piece of it is taken from non-Jewish Syrian culture. And so what's the relationship? There's a relationship of pride clearly for the culture. I'm guessing that doesn't extend to the government, which did not always treat the Jewish people so well. And there has to be some sort of, I would think, some sort of tension there as well, or maybe not.
Those are great questions. I mean, I could talk about that for an hour, but I'll try and do it in 60 seconds. Those are really deep, essential questions. I think that Arabic culture in general does not form its approach to authenticity. So whether you're Syrian or if you being the Middle Eastern musical system, the Middle Eastern musical culture is just its own culture. I often had that question and wanted to ask Motawil, what makes this Jewish? And I was so afraid that he would just like hit me in the head and say something like, "You stupid Ashkenaz, you just don't understand anything I've taught you." I think it's a great question for us. I don't think it's a question for them. Yeah. I think that it's because they did it and they do it, that it's really important. And, there's a Rav Ovadia Yosef, who's a well-known former chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel. He's now passed away. But in one of his tshuvot, when he wrote about music, he says that using non-Jewish melodies is fine because he says music is lo lahishtamesh ba. Music is not a physical entity, and it's recreated every time. And as long as you're recreating it in the spirit of holiness, then it's okay to use. So it's not that they would have a halachic issue with this because it's not not Jewish. It's simply an aspect that, you know, if it's from an Arabic love song, you know, that really would have been more of the rabbinic issue, but it's not really an issue for the people doing it. I mean, they're doing it because they love Arabic music. They love Arab culture. And this is their way to express, you know, their Arab culture. And anyways, there's just so much more to say about that. But I think that's kind of the bottom line, is that they'll find a rationale if they need one to do it. And they're doing it because they are so deeply connected to it. When it comes to kind of like the tensions with modern politics, you know, I mean, that's a whole separate talk. Yeah. But the best way that I can say that is that when I was doing my research with them, the Oslo Accords in the 90s were really developing. And whenever that would take a sour turn, I would hear them saying, you know, afterwards in synagogue when they're talking about Israel, they would often say, the problem is the Ashkenazic leadership in Israel. If they would just have the Middle Eastern Jews negotiate with the Syrians and the Jordanians and so on, then they know how to make peace. So I think that they're able to kind of separate themselves in this way that they love the culture, but they're separated from the politics. And in large measure, they always laid low. The Syrian Jews were in their own little mellah, their own little community. They were able to run their own schools, their own community. They paid the tax. So there's a certain level by which, you know, they didn't seek to be involved in government. They didn't seek to be to have acceptance. Like they never would be accepted by a majority Muslim culture. But they really enjoyed being Jewish.
Thank you. Thanks for that. A brief answer to a really big question. We just have a couple of questions. So why don't we start? Seth, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself? You can go ahead and ask your question.
Sure, thank you. Fantastic presentation. I was gonna ask about who does the singing in the Jewish services in the Syrian community. Is it a lay person who's singing, or is there some kind of a cantor or rabbi, or would it be rotating members of the community?
Yeah, great question. So it really comes into two categories. One is that the rabbis will often lead tefillah. And, you know, the Syrian rabbis who told me there's no way you can be a successful Syrian rabbi if you don't have a good voice. If you don't have a good voice, you're not going to be able to succeed. And as the community was developing in Flatbush in the 50s and 60s, they often didn't have Sephardic rabbis. So they had a number of Ashkenazic rabbis that are beloved and were part of the community. That's now changed in the new generation with trying to get their own homegrown Syrian rabbis. But what also is coterminous with that is the fact that there are a lot of lay people who develop and sing. And all the men that I worked with were all in what we Ashkenazim will call the shmata business. They were all in, you know, the manufacturing of the garment industry. And their devotion to their community was being the chazanim. And many of these people were, if they were paid very, very little. It was really done out of a labor of love. They've tried in various ways to start a cantorial school, but it really hasn't taken off. It just doesn't work in this community. Yeshiva of Flatbush and some of the other schools in Brooklyn, which have a lot of Syrians, they have a lot of the young rabbis and cantors and leaders of the community coming and teaching this Pismo. So slowly it's kind of, you know, emerging. And well, like Mo Tawil, who I worked with, while his children weren't interested in being cantors, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren are. And one of the gifts of being a scholar is I've been in touch with them and have written articles about kind of demarcating what different generations are really doing. And the younger generations are now they're college educated. The one who kind of, there are two, there's one who's a pharmacist and one who's a dentist. And they both have this WhatsApp group where every Shabbat they discuss the melodies that they're going to use. And it's fun because occasionally they'll ask me a question, about something that, I might know. And so, I'd get to, still be a part of those conversations. But it's happening mostly as a labor of love.
And within, as a corollary to that, my understanding, and Professor Kligman, you would know more about this than I do, but my understanding is that outside of the reform and conservative movements, the cantorate really isn't professionalized the way that our community is used to.
In general, that's true. There is a cantorial school with a certificate that's a part of Yeshiva University. And there's also one in Israel that Naftali Herstig does as well. And these kind of certificate programs are largely more or less building a network. And a lot of the cantors who work in the Orthodox communities, either in Europe, Israel, or America that I'm aware of, there are very, very few that hire a full-time cantor. In Los Angeles, there are only 2 full-time Orthodox cantors, Arik at Beth Jacob and Netanel Baram at Young Israel North Beverly Hills. There are many Orthodox synagogues in LA, but only 2 have a full-time paid chazan. If there's any pay for a chazan in the Orthodox community, it might be for the high holidays, or other holidays, but largely it's members of the community. And the ones who are employed through Netanel Herstig School in Europe that I've met over the years are usually part-time employed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Scott Spencer, who you may know, has a question here for you. He asked me to read it for him. He said, first of all, he says thank you. And he says, you mentioned that there was a strong historic tradition of the Jewish community being patrons of the arts back in Syria. Do you see echoes of that in today's community in Brooklyn?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Scott, or Professor Spencer. There are representations of that. There's a well-known artist in, Brooklyn, outside of the Jewish community, has a very large Arabic community along Atlantic Avenue. And there are many fascinating stories about how the Arabic musicians have made a living by working in the Syrian community, playing for parties and different things. There's one musician by the name of Simon Shaheen, who's really one of the most well-known Middle Eastern artists and has received national accommodation as a culture bearer of the Middle Eastern tradition. And it's like a great deal of pride if the Syrian Jews are able to get Simon Shaheen to come and play for one of their parties. So in large measure, their patronage now is creating their own sort of cultural contexts of music. Living among the Syrian Jews, there are Egyptian Jews, Persian Jews, Lebanese Jews, and they have formed different type of musical communities. It's too complex now for me to unravel, but as a part of that community of Middle Eastern Jews who like music, there's a very interesting thing that is somewhat controversial, but I'll just state the facts that I know, and that is that this is sometime in the 2000s when I was still in the community, that they posted on a traffic signal, like they put like community notices, on a pole, and it was a rabbinic ban for going to Middle Eastern nightclubs, even if they serve kosher food. So clearly there are Middle Eastern nightclubs that are trying to attract the Syrian Jews or the Middle Eastern Jews, wow. And they'll attract them by serving kosher food. The rabbis are aware of this and they don't want this, to continue. So there is a desire for Arabic music, and it's one of those musical communities that's not, big, it's not commercial, it flies under the radar, but it's there.
Professor Kligman, I want to thank you so much. I know you have an incredibly busy schedule. We are so grateful that you spend time with us. We're even more grateful that you are right down the street from us, and that we know that there will be many more occasions that we can be together and learn together. And I just want to thank you so much for being with us today and getting us ready for this Shabbat that's coming up. I hope all of you who are here on the Zoom and those of you who are watching afterwards will be able to join us either virtually or in person. Thanks again. Everybody have a wonderful afternoon.
My pleasure. Good luck with the service. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.